Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're embarking on a massive journey together. We are charting a course from the deeply isolated, fragmented Middle Ages straight through to the highly interconnected, bustling modern era we live in right now. It is a story of incredible risk, revolutionary technology, and sweeping global consequences. Let's get into it.
Okay, let's dive right into this. How did a few small wooden ships and a craving for spices completely change the entire world? I mean, it sounds almost absurd, right? But the reality is that the deeply complex, globalized world we navigate every single day actually started with some incredibly risky, practically suicidal ocean voyages undertaken in tiny, fragile wooden ships. And a huge part of the motivation? Spices. Yep, simple flavorings that were literally worth their weight in gold back then.
Section 1. The Isolated Medieval World. To really grasp how monumental these discoveries were, we've got to rewind the clock a bit. During the Middle Ages, the general public, and honestly, even a lot of scholars, had this extremely limited geographical mindset. Compare that to the scientific reality we know today. Back then, many people held on to the belief that the Earth was stationary and flat. They were completely unaware of a spherical planet orbiting the sun, governed by gravity. Because of this total lack of scientific understanding, people were absolutely terrified to explore beyond the horizon.
The whole mood of the era was defined by this profound fear of sailing into infinity. Sailors genuinely believed that if they sailed too far out into the vast, uncharted ocean, they would quite literally just fall off the edge of the world. Or, worse, that the boiling seas were filled with terrifying gargantuan sea monsters ready to swallow their ships whole. So stepping onto a boat back then, that meant staring directly into the terrifying unknown.
Section 2. Sparks of the Exploration.
So if everyone was so paralyzed by fear, what actually forced humanity out of its comfortable, isolated medieval bubble? Well, the biggest spark was purely economic. For a really long time, trade between Europe and Asia happened over traditional land routes. But when the Turks took control of Constantinople and these vital pathways, they imposed massive, crippling taxes on anyone passing through. European merchants essentially hit a brick wall. They were financially backed into a corner and literally forced to seek out alternative, untaxed sea routes if they wanted to keep their businesses alive.
And this brilliantly illustrates the massive technological leap that made those new sea routes possible. Necessity truly became the mother of invention here. Ocean navigation suddenly became a reality thanks to the mariner's compass to point north, the astrolabe to calculate latitude using the stars, early telescopes, and massive advancements in cartography or map-making. And perhaps most importantly, the development of the caravel. This was a strong, highly maneuverable wooden ship that could actually withstand the absolute pounding of the open ocean.
Section 3. Pioneers of the Ocean. With these incredible new tools in hand, the stage was set for a whole new breed of daring individuals who threw caution completely to the wind. In just a few short decades during the golden age of exploration, the map of the known world exploded. In 1488, Bartholomew Diaz shocked the world by reaching the southern tip of Africa. Just 4 years later, in 1492, Christopher Columbus stumbled upon the Americas. By 1498, Vasco da Gama finally cracked the code, rounding Africa and hitting India. And in 1519, Magellan's expedition proved the oceans were actually interconnected by successfully circumnavigating the entire globe.
Now, as you can imagine, it wasn't without some major geographical mix-ups. Take Christopher Columbus, for example. When he landed in the Americas, he was so utterly convinced that he had successfully sailed all the way around to the Indian subcontinent that he mistakenly labeled the native populations there as Red Indians. It was a truly immense miscalculation, but one that completely accidentally opened up an entirely new hemisphere to Europe.
But you've got to wonder, why keep risking these wildly dangerous voyages? Well, look at this staggering number, a 26 times profit margin. When Vasco da Gama finally returned to Europe from India, the spices he brought back, pepper, cinnamon, cardamom, sold for 26 times what they cost him. This massive, unprecedented economic incentive was the absolute driving force behind these dangerous voyages. The promise of that kind of unbelievable wealth changes everything.
Section 4. The Global Trade Boom.
These successful voyages triggered immediate, earth-shattering economic consequences, including the swift death of local, isolated barter systems. Central to this boom was mercantilism. This was basically an economic practice where nations sought to increase their global power by fiercely controlling trade and hoarding precious metals, specifically gold and silver. This massive influx of new wealth from overseas trade routes directly led to the creation of modern banking systems, credit, and huge, powerful state-sponsored trading companies.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how the boom triggered a physical exchange that permanently altered diets and economies worldwide. Europe was suddenly exporting hordes of gold and silver to fund their operations, Asia was flooding the European market with incredibly coveted spices and tea, and the Americas introduced entirely new, high-calorie crops to the rest of the world, like maize, potatoes, and even tobacco. It was a completely unprecedented biological and commercial exchange.
Section 5. Impacts of the discoveries.
The movement of goods was really just the beginning. The sweeping, world-altering consequences went far beyond what was on the dinner table. This period rapidly birthed imperialism, which is the policy of extending a country's power and influence through colonization or military force. The fierce economic competition over these new trade routes led European nations, most notably England, Spain, Portugal, and France, to move way beyond just trading. They began using military force to conquer territories, establishing vast colonies across the Americas, Africa, and Asia just to secure resources and maintain their mercantile dominance.
Alongside this territorial expansion came massive cultural and scientific shifts. There was a widespread, often forceful spread of Christianity by European missionaries, and Western cultural norms began to permeate across the globe. But at the exact same time, the undeniable proof of new lands and interconnected oceans finally crushed those old, lingering medieval superstitions about flat Earths and sea monsters. A brand new scientific mindset was permanently taking hold. However, we must address the stark reality of this era. As European nations established vast, resource-heavy colonies, particularly in the Americas, they generated an insatiable demand for cheap manual labor to work the plantations and mines. This immense economic demand birthed one of the darkest chapters in human history, the brutal and highly exploitative transatlantic slave trade.
What initially began in some areas as a search for commercial labor devolved rapidly from individual labor into a horrific, systematic exploitation. Millions of people were violently ripped from their homes in Africa and subjected to centuries-long torment, forced into grueling, unpaid labor across the Americas and beyond. It is a profound tragedy, and it was deeply intertwined with the economic boom of this entire era.
So, as we pull back and look at the epic narrative arc we've covered today, the contrast is truly stunning. We started out with the medieval mindset, isolated, localized, and completely driven by fear of the unknown. Contrast that with the results of these geographical discoveries. They laid the blueprint for the modern world, a reality that is globally interconnected, culturally blended, and absolutely driven by international trade and scientific inquiry.
I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. How does the legacy of these early sea voyages continue to shape the wealth, the borders, and the systemic inequalities of our modern, interconnected world? It is fascinating and honestly perhaps a bit humbling to realize that the world we live in today, with all its incredible triumphs and its deeply rooted flaws, was fundamentally born on the wildly pitching decks of those small wooden ships. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you next time.